In the quiet halls of Korean palaces, centuries before satellites traced the outlines of continents, a masterpiece was born. A map unlike anything the world had ever seen. The year was 1402, a time when Europe was still emerging from the medieval shadow, and cartographers in the West barely grasped the size of Africa. Yet, in the kingdom of Joseon, scholars and visionaries gathered under candlelight, guided by ink, parchment, and the vast curiosity of their minds, to draw the known world as they imagined it to be. This was the Kangnido, a map that whispered of places far beyond the horizon, blending truth, legend, and vision into one monumental piece of human understanding. The Kangnido, whose full name translates roughly to Map of Integrated Lands and Regions of Historical Countries and Capitals, was created during the reign of King Taizong, the third ruler of the Joseon dynasty. It was an age of intellectual revival in East Asia. China had just transitioned from the Mongol Yuan dynasty to the Ming dynasty, and knowledge was once again flowing along the Silk Roads, from Persia to India, from Arabia to China, and finally into Korea. Korea, positioned like a hinge between empires, became a custodian of both Chinese scholarship and its own growing sense of world identity. The creation of the Kangnido was not an accident. It was the work of two brilliant Korean scholars, Kim Sa-hyung and Yi Ho, under the direction of the Joseon court official Yi Mu. Their goal was not merely to chart Korea's borders, it was to place Korea in the center of the world's knowledge. Using Chinese sources such as the Da Ming Hun Yi Tu, the amalgamated map of the Great Ming Empire, and older Mongol geographical records, the scholars merged data gathered from Islamic traders, Central Asian envoys, and possibly even fragments of information from as far as Africa. The result was staggering, a world map that portrayed nearly the entire known world, from Japan and India to Arabia and parts of Africa. Decades before European explorers like Columbus or Vasco da Gama set sail. Imagine the scene: a vast scroll of silk spread across the floor of a royal workshop. The smell of ink and rice glue thick in the air. A team of scribes leaned over the fabric, sketching the curvature of mountains and rivers. The scholars debated distances and directions, translating foreign names written in Arabic or Persian into Chinese characters. To them, this was more than art. It was a vision of the world's structure, an attempt to make sense of humanity's scattered lands under heaven's gaze. When they finished, they had produced something extraordinary: a map over 2 meters wide, colored in rich earth tones, with the Korean peninsula placed proudly near the center, the known world expanding outward like the petals of a cosmic flower. Unlike many maps of the time, the Kangnido did not imagine the world as a mystical realm surrounded by dragons or ocean monsters. It was surprisingly realistic. China, for instance, was drawn with remarkable accuracy, its provinces carefully outlined, major rivers and cities marked with precision that even modern historians admire. Japan appeared in a tripartite form: Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, each distinct, though slightly distorted. To the west, India and Arabia were depicted, their place names echoing the ancient trade routes of the Silk Road. Even the contours of Africa, though crude, extended astonishingly far south, hinting at knowledge of the continent's true scale that would not be rediscovered in Europe for another century. For a historian looking back, this map is a quiet marvel. It reflects not only what the Koreans knew, but what they believed. To them, the world was not just geography, it was a moral order, a harmony of civilization centered around China's cultural gravity, yet with Korea as a vital participant. The Joseon dynasty saw itself as both a student and a guardian of Confucian civilization. The Kangnido, therefore, was not a tool of conquest like many European maps would later become. It was a mirror, showing a world in which knowledge, culture, and diplomacy formed the backbone of identity. But how did Korean scholars in 1402 know so much about lands as distant as Africa or Arabia? The answer lies in the interconnected web of the Mongol Empire, which had spanned from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea less than a century earlier. The Mongols had unified Eurasia in a way no one else had before, establishing routes that allowed the flow of maps, manuscripts, and messengers between civilizations that had once been strangers. Islamic cartographers, inheriting the geographic wisdom of the Greeks and Persians, produced maps that blended empirical observation with mathematical precision. These maps, often translated and adapted by Chinese scholars during the Yuan dynasty, eventually reached Korea through diplomatic and scholarly exchanges. Thus, the Kangnido was a fusion, a cultural and scientific bridge between East and West. It incorporated the proportional systems of Islamic geography, the administrative clarity of Chinese cartography, and the philosophical order of Korean scholarship. The result was not just a world map, it was a synthesis of civilizations, a moment when human curiosity transcended borders. When the Kangnido was presented to King Taejong, it was more than a royal gift. It was a declaration of Korea's intellectual power. It told the king that his kingdom stood at the intersection of global knowledge, not at the periphery. In an age before telescopes and compasses had become commonplace, such a map symbolized wisdom, authority, and vision. It was, in essence, a crown made of ink. Over the following decades, copies of the Kangnido circulated among scholars and officials. Though the original 1402 version was eventually lost, several copies survived, including one preserved in Japan's Ryukoku University and another in Honkoji Temple. These surviving versions have allowed modern historians to reconstruct what the original must have looked like. When Western scholars first saw the map in the 19th century, they were stunned. Here was a document from Korea that predated European global maps, yet contained a surprisingly accurate depiction of Africa, Arabia, and India. And so, a question arises. Did the makers of the Kangnido truly understand the scale of the world? Perhaps not in exact measurements, but their vision was broader than most of their contemporaries. They saw beyond the seas, beyond the deserts, and imagined a world in which all human lands were connected. They didn't draw boundaries of conquest. They drew bridges of culture. The artistry of the Kangnido also tells a story of its own. The mountains are painted in deep greens and browns, the rivers in soft blue lines flowing through the continents like veins of the earth. Capitals are marked with small red circles, radiating importance. The map, though scientific in intent, carries a poetic heart. As if the artists themselves were aware, they were capturing something eternal. Even today, when you look at the Kangnido, you can feel its rhythm, a pulse that beats with the curiosity of an entire civilization. The 15th century was an age of contrasts. In Europe, maps were still bound by myth, Jerusalem often placed at the center of the world, with paradise depicted as a garden somewhere beyond the known. In Korea, the Kangnido placed its own center not out of arrogance, but perspective. To see the world from where one stands. That was its quiet genius. It did not claim to own the world. It sought to understand it. Centuries later, this same spirit of inquiry would fuel explorers like Zheng He, the Chinese admiral whose fleets sailed across the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s, almost the same time the Kangnido was being painted. Some scholars believe the Kangnido may even have incorporated data from these Chinese voyages, capturing ports and islands freshly recorded by Ming sailors. If true, it would make the Kangnido not just a map of the world as imagined, but a record of one of humanity's greatest bursts of exploration. One that unfolded not in the West, but in the East. In many ways, the Kangnido stands as a quiet rebuttal to the Eurocentric narrative of discovery. Long before European explorers claimed to have discovered the world, Korea and its Asian neighbors were already charting it, drawing coastlines, naming regions, and envisioning the vastness of Earth. The map reminds us that the history of exploration is not owned by any one civilization. It belongs to all who have dared to imagine what lies beyond the horizon. As the centuries passed, the Kangnido's legacy faded from mainstream memory. The Joseon dynasty turned inward, focusing on governance and Confucian ethics rather than grand cosmography. Yet, the map remained, hidden in libraries, preserved in temples, waiting for rediscovery. When modern historians finally examined it, they found not only geographical data, but a window into a moment when Korea saw itself as part of a grand, interconnected world, and perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about the Kangnido. It is not just a map of the world, it is a map of human thought. Every line, every curve, every character written in black ink speaks of a people who refused to be blind to the world beyond their borders. They knew that to understand themselves, they had to understand the earth itself. It is easy to imagine the awe of those who first unrolled the map over 600 years ago. The faint scent of ink, the shimmer of silk, the delicate brushwork revealing mountains, rivers, and cities, a silent world coming to life before their eyes. To them, this was not merely geography, it was revelation. The candlelight still flickers in the royal study, long after the scholars have left. The map lies open, silent, vast, the ink drying into permanence. To those who created it, the Kangnido was more than parchment. It was a statement, a declaration. That knowledge itself could be as powerful as armies. It was Korea's vision of the earth, not imagined through conquest, but through connection. In the early 15th century, the Korean peninsula was undergoing profound change. The new Joseon dynasty was still shaping its identity, drawing deeply from Confucian ideals of order, virtue, and harmony. While Europe was beginning its age of expansion, fueled by ambition and gold, Korea turned inward to strengthen its institutions, its culture, and its understanding of the wider world. The Kangnido stood as a perfect symbol of that balance, rooted in Korean thought, yet open to global insight. To grasp the true significance of the Kangnido, we have to imagine the context of its creation. The world of 1402 was not small, it was simply disconnected. Empires and kingdoms rose and fell, each surrounded by its own myths and maps. Europe's T.T. Fiertois. Cartographers were still bound by the medieval mindset, where theology dictated geography. Africa was a mystery. Asia was a rumor. And beyond the western seas, the Americas were still hidden in shadow. Yet in East Asia, the story was different. Centuries of trade, war, and diplomacy had created a network of exchange that connected civilizations from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Silk Road was not just a route for goods, it was an artery of ideas. Through it flowed silk and porcelain, yes, but also mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and geography. The Kangnido absorbed this legacy like a mirror reflecting many suns. One can imagine the information arriving in fragments. A Persian trader describing the distant coasts of Africa, a Chinese envoy recounting the rivers of India, a Buddhist monk sharing tales from Central Asia. Each voice a small thread, woven together by Korean scholars into a grand tapestry of the world. The Kangnido is not perfect. Its proportions are strange, its distance is uncertain. But within its lines lives something even more valuable than accuracy: perspective. It dares to imagine the world as a single, continuous whole. To the scholars who drew it, geography was not merely physical, it was moral. Confucian thought taught that understanding the world was part of understanding humanity's place in the cosmic order. A map, therefore, was a spiritual act, a reflection of harmony between heaven, earth, and man. The Kangnido embodies that philosophy completely. It sees no center of the world except knowledge itself. Look closely at the map's composition, and you can read its philosophy. China lies in the middle, but not with arrogance. It is drawn large because it was the administrative heart of civilization, the source of cultural gravity. Korea sits to the east, detailed with loving precision, every river and mountain named. To the west lie India, Persia, and Arabia, depicted not as barbaric fringes, but as noble lands, part of the same living earth. Even Africa appears, its septism coasts stretching down with surprising accuracy, the Nile drawn like a living artery through the continent. And then, Europe. Small, modest, almost shy, positioned near the edge of the map. Not diminished, but distant. To the map makers of Korea, Europe was not irrelevant. It was simply far away, a region of mystery beyond the great expanse of Central Asia. They knew it existed, but it held little immediate significance. This subtle hierarchy reveals something beautiful about how early Asian scholars saw the world. They did not divide it by race or creed. They divided it by knowledge, by the level of understanding and refinement each region possessed. And through that lens, the Kangnido becomes less a geographical map and more a map of civilization itself. The scholars who made it were not explorers in the Western sense. They did not sail oceans or claim new lands, but in their own way, they were voyagers, voyagers of the mind. Their brushes traveled farther than any ship of their time. As the decades passed, the Kangnido's fame grew quietly within the halls of power. It was referenced by scholars, admired by courtiers, and preserved as a symbol of wisdom. Copies were made, each slightly altered, some emphasizing China, others Korea. A few even adapted new information as it arrived from Ming emissaries or Buddhist monks returning from the West. The Kangnido evolved, like a living organism of ink and paper, growing with every new idea. But history is never kind to parchment. Time, war, and invasion erased much of Korea's early treasures. The original 1402 Kangnido was lost, perhaps burned, perhaps buried, during the turbulent centuries that followed. Yet, by some miracle, copies survived. Two of the most important found their way to Japan, preserved in temples and libraries. These copies became the key to reconstructing the lost original, and through them, the voice of 15th century Korea speaks to us once more. Modern historians who study the Kangnido often find themselves in awe of its precision. The depiction of Africa, for instance, extends well beyond what even European maps showed at the same time. Some experts believe this knowledge came from Islamic sources. Maps created under the influence of the great Arab geographer al-Idrisi, whose 12th century world map was one of the most advanced of the medieval period. Through trade and translation, fragments of these Islamic maps likely reached China, and, from there, Korea. The result was a map that, astonishingly, knew of the African continent's general shape nearly a century before European explorers confirmed it. It's a quiet but powerful reminder. The pursuit of knowledge does not follow one path. The great story of discovery is not a European invention. It is a human inheritance. And yet, the Kangnido was not meant for navigation. It was not a sailor's tool, but a scholar's treasure. A world not to be crossed, but to be understood. Where European maps sought to dominate the world, the Kangnido sought to comprehend it. In this difference lies the soul of the map. The Kangnido's design reflects an ancient principle, that true knowledge must balance heaven's order with human understanding. Each region is not just drawn, but placed in moral harmony. The rivers flow like lifelines. The mountains rise like vertebrae of the world. The brushstrokes feel almost alive, deliberate, meditative. reverent. The scholars worked not to claim the earth, but to honor it. As we move through history, the world begins to catch up with their vision. In 1492, nearly a century later, Columbus would cross the Atlantic and declare a new world. In 1507, Martin Waldseemüller would draw the first European map, naming America. But long before these events, Korea had already drawn a world that stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from the northern steppes to Africa's edge. The Kangnido quietly predated the so-called Age of Discovery by almost 100 years. When historians realize this, it changes everything. It reminds us that the story of world mapping did not begin in Europe. It began wherever curiosity refused to be confined. Even more fascinating is how the Kangnido reflects the mingling of faith and reason. In Europe, geography was often framed through religion. Jerusalem at the center, paradise at the top. In Korea, the map breathes the philosophy of Confucian balance. It does not seek divine justification. It seeks harmony. The world is shown as one, interconnected whole. A network of rivers, roads, and civilizations bound by invisible ties. Imagine a viewer in the Joseon court, standing before the map. Perhaps a young scholar, freshly appointed, gazing at its expanse for the first time. He would see the known world unfolding like a scroll of destiny. To him, it was both humbling and inspiring. A reminder that even the smallest kingdom was part of a grand design. That feeling, that sense of belonging to something vast and beautiful, is what makes the Kangnido so powerful even today. As the centuries passed, Korea's focus shifted. The kingdom entered periods of isolation, its scholars turning inward to preserve culture amid outside pressures. The Kangnido faded into obscurity, its copies tucked away, forgotten by time. Yet its influence lingered subtly, in the continued Korean reverence for scholarship, in the belief that understanding the world begins with observation and respect. When Western historians rediscovered the map in the late 19th century, they were astonished. How could a 15th century Asian map contain such accurate representations of Africa and Arabia, when Europe itself had not yet charted them? It challenged long-held assumptions about the centers of knowledge. The Kangnido forced scholars to reconsider the timeline of discovery. It proved that the thirst to understand our planet was universal, that long before the sails of European ships touched distant shores, the minds of Korean scholars had already traced them with ink. Today, the Kangnido is preserved in museums and digitized for the world to see. When you look at it, its colors faded, its silk creased, you can still feel the pulse of those who made it. The rivers still flow, the mountains still rise, the continents still breathe with the energy of vision. It is, in every sense, a bridge across time. Standing before it, one can almost hear the faint echo of brushes gliding across silk, the quiet murmur of scholars debating the world's proportions, the soft crackle of candlelight. You can feel the tension between certainty and wonder, the eternal balance that defines all human knowledge. In that silence, the Kangnido speaks. It tells us that discovery is not about reaching new lands. It is about connecting minds. It reminds us that maps are not made only of ink and parchment, but of imagination and courage. Because to draw the world is to believe that it can be understood. And that belief, born in Korea in 1402, still shapes us today. The Kangnido remains one of the most extraordinary artifacts in human history. Not because it was flawless, but because it was fearless. It dared to show a world that no one had fully seen, to unite knowledge that no one had yet connected. It stands as a testament to the timeless power of curiosity, and to the idea that truth, like the earth itself, is round. As the light fades in the palace study, and the final brushstroke dries, the scholars step back from their creation. Before them lies not just a map, but a message, a vision of humanity's shared destiny, painted in lines of ink and faith. The world, they seem to say, is one. And in that moment, 600 years ago, they were right. The Kangnido Map is no longer just a relic of ink and silk. It is a living memory, the heartbeat of an age when curiosity was a sacred act. Its lines have outlived dynasties. Its symbols have survived conquest. And its message, that the world is one, connected and knowable, still echoes across 6 centuries of human history. But to understand its full legacy, we must follow the map's journey through time, across fire, loss, rediscovery, and rebirth. When the Joseon dynasty was still young, the map was treasured, studied, and occasionally copied by royal scholars. It served as a quiet reminder that Korea was part of a grand cosmic order, where knowledge connected heaven, earth, and all nations. For decades, the Kangnido hung in royal archives, its silk edges protected by wooden rods, its painted surfaces rolled and unrolled by hands that understood its worth. Then came the storms of history. Invasions swept across the peninsula. The Imjin War, the Japanese invasions of 1592 and 1597, devastated Korea's cultural heritage. Temples burned, archives were looted, and centuries of scholarship were lost in smoke and ash. It was during this chaos that many of Korea's ancient treasures disappeared, their fate unknown. Yet, somehow, the Kangnido endured. One of its surviving copies, now known as the Honkoji copy, found its way to Japan, likely carried off during those same invasions. Another, the Ryukoku copy, was later discovered in the collections of Buddhist monks, carefully preserved through generations. These surviving versions became windows into the past, allowing future historians to glimpse the original vision that had once adorned a royal Korean chamber. As the centuries passed, the world the Kangnido had imagined began to take physical shape. European navigators charted new continents, traced the African coasts, and mapped the globe's curvature. But the irony is undeniable. The world that European explorers discovered was already outlined in the imagination of Korean scholars. For centuries, the West told the story of discovery as a one-sided tale, of daring men with ships and sextants conquering the unknown. But the Kangnido reminds us of something humbler and deeper, that discovery begins not with conquest, but with curiosity. While Columbus sailed west, the ink of the East had already dreamt of the same horizon. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world had changed completely. Empires rose on the strength of navigation and trade. Science replaced faith as the measure of truth. Maps became weapons, tools of colonization and power. Yet in dusty libraries and forgotten temple archives, the Kangnido slept quietly, its silk rolled tight, untouched by the greed that consumed so many other relics of knowledge. Then, in the late 19th century, Western scholars stumbled upon it again. The first recorded study appeared in Japan around the 1870s, when historians began to notice a strange, ancient world map that seemed to defy its time. The continents were familiar, yet different. Africa was there, Arabia was there, even Europe was faintly visible. But the map was undeniably Asian. Its brushwork, its calligraphy, its spiritual balance. It was only then that the world began to rediscover the Kangnido's true significance. In 1901, German sinologist Friedrich Hirth mentioned it in his writings, comparing it to the Chinese Daming Hunyitu. Later, other historians like Paul Pelliot and George Coetus studied it closely, realizing it was not just another copy of Chinese geography. It was uniquely Korean, a synthesis of multiple traditions. The Kangnido became a key to understanding how knowledge traveled across continents long before European globalization. Through careful study, scholars identified the map's sources. The largest influence came from Chinese administrative maps, particularly those of the Ming dynasty, but details in Africa, India, and Arabia pointed unmistakably toward Islamic cartography, likely derived from the world maps that circulated under Mongol patronage in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Mongol Empire, stretching from Korea to the Mediterranean, had served as the greatest information network the pre-modern world had ever seen. It was through this web that ideas, maps, and astronomical data traveled from Baghdad to Beijing, and eventually to the scholars of Joseon, Korea. This interconnectedness is what makes the Kangnido extraordinary. It is not the product of isolation, but of synthesis, the meeting point of civilizations that never physically met. It is the East's quiet counterpart to Europe's later Age of Discovery. To look at the Kangnido today is to see human curiosity painted across geography. It is a document of hope, proof that even without ships or compasses, people could imagine the entire world. Imagine, for a moment, how the scholars must have felt as they painted the coast of Africa, or the distant lands of Arabia, places they had never seen, but somehow knew existed. It must have felt like touching the edge of the universe, a brush stroke away from the unknown. The Kangnido is not just a map. It's a poem about human imagination. Its story also reflects something deeper about Korean identity. Korea has often been described as a small nation surrounded by giants, caught between China, Japan, and the vast ocean. Yet, time and again, it proved itself capable of creating wonders that transcended size and power. The Kangnido is one of those wonders. It shows a Korea unafraid to engage with the world, confident in its culture yet open to others. Even its name, Kangnido, meaning map of integrated lands and regions of historical countries and capitals, reveals its purpose. It was never meant to glorify conquest or power. It was meant to integrate, to connect, to record all lands as part of one shared world. Every civilization leaves behind its mirrors. Some build temples, others write books. Korea painted the earth. When viewed through this lens, the Kangnido stands beside the Rosetta Stone, the Ptolemaic maps, and Al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana, not as a lesser echo, but as an equal voice in the human story of knowledge. It is proof that the desire to understand the world was never limited to one hemisphere or culture. Today, digital historians and cartographers use advanced imaging to analyze the surviving Kangnido copies. They can see the individual brush strokes, the layering of pigments, the corrections made by human hands 600 years ago. Some lines are faint, some bold, but each carries a pulse of intention. You can almost see the moment a scholar hesitated before painting the curve of a coastline, or the precise flick of the wrist that gave birth to a mountain range. Modern science can trace the ink. Technology can preserve the image, but only imagination can feel what it meant. In a world obsessed with expansion, the Kangnido whispers a different message, one of unity. It reminds us that even when divided by borders, language, and empire, humanity has always shared the same horizon. It's this universality that gives the Kangnido its power today. When displayed in modern museums, whether in Seoul, Kyoto, or digital archives online, visitors often stop in silence before it. They see not only the continents and rivers, but the humility of its vision. There are no monsters at the edges, no seas of fire, no warnings of the unknown. The world is whole, knowable, continuous. In an era of chaos and uncertainty, the map feels almost prophetic. The 21st century has redrawn the world in ways the scholars of 1402 could never imagine. Satellites orbit above, oceans are crossed in hours, and maps live inside glowing screens. Yet the essence remains unchanged. We still map to understand, and we still seek connection. The Kangnido becomes a mirror once again, this time reflecting us. Because we, too, live in an age of integration. Our maps may be digital, but the questions they answer are the same. Who are we? How are we connected? What lies beyond our known horizon? And just like the scholars of Joseon, we continue to draw, not with brushes on silk, but with pixels on glass, trying to comprehend a world that keeps expanding before our eyes. The final scene in this journey returns to that quiet palace room in 1402. The lamps burn low. The scholars lean back, their work finally done. One of them, perhaps Kim Se-hyung himself, gazes at the map, eyes tired but filled with satisfaction. Around him, the murmurs of assistance fade, replaced by the sound of the wind through the open window. Outside, the night sky is vast, a sea of stars stretching endlessly above the capital of Hanyang. Each star a world, each spark a question. The scholar lifts his brush one last time, makes a small correction, then places it down beside the inkstone. The map glows in the candlelight, a reflection of heaven and earth bound together in ink. He knows that one day, perhaps centuries later, others will look upon this map and wonder how he could have imagined so much. But he also knows that imagination is the only tool that has ever truly mapped the world. And as the scene fades, the voice of history returns, soft, measured, timeless. The Kangnido is not just a map. It is an act of faith in humanity's ability to know, to learn, and to connect. It was born in a kingdom few in the West had heard of, created by scholars who never saw the lands they drew, and yet, it foretold the modern world. It showed that Korea, a small peninsula between empires, once held the entire earth within its grasp, not through power, but through vision. When we speak of the history of exploration, we often begin with Columbus, Magellan, or Da Gama. But perhaps the story begins here instead, in a royal chamber in 1402, where ink and wisdom met to create the world anew. The Kangnido teaches us that discovery is not a Western story, but a human one, that knowledge does not belong to conquerors but to dreamers, that the world, no matter how divided, has always been drawn together by those who dared to imagine it whole. Even now, as satellites map the stars and artificial intelligence traces the contours of galaxies, the same truth remains. The act of mapping is the act of believing, and belief is eternal. The camera draws close to the Kangnido. The silk shimmers softly. The outlines of Africa, Arabia, India, and China glow faintly in golden light. A slow orchestral swell rises in the background, strings, deep and resonant, evoking both time and eternity. Then, silence. In that silence, the world breathes again. Because 600 years later, the Kangnido still whispers, "To map the world is to find ourselves